Hello. Can I have your attention, please? Welcome back, everyone. The summer went fast, didn't it? Yeah. All right, we want to make sure you're seated at the right place. So we've got you seated at tables based on the search committee that you are serving on. And in some cases, we've put two searches together at one table. So this table, Carissa, is exercise science and geology. That's this table. What's entrepreneurship and MPPA? The professionals search. We got this one is hospitality and accounting. There's two searches here, hospitality and accounting. School of Ed and ART members who have also been invited to join. This is tradition undergraduate psych and clinical psych graduate. Yeah, Jamie's here. Jamie's joining here. There you go, Jamie. Math. This is math. We have deans in the back. All right, so everybody. Okay, so we've got everybody at the right places. All right, anybody have questions about where you're sitting? Okay. So I'm very happy to introduce to you our guest for the day, but doesn't seem like a guest anymore. Deanna has spent a lot of time with us here on campus. Many of you have worked with Deanna Cherry. She is with the Center for Urban Education, the Q group from USC that we hired in as consultants to help us with our inclusivity and equity efforts. Deanna is a lead senior facilitator for the Center for Urban Education. And she also was the keynote speaker at Campus Community Day. So she's been doing a lot of work with us, and we're so thrilled that you were available to come and run this session for us on implicit bias training. And there are a few of your committee members who were not able to be here today, and we are recording this session, and so we will be recording this so they'll be able to watch and catch up on what they have missed. So I'm going to hand it over to Deanna.
All right. Great to see everyone. So this is going to be more of a workshop than a presentation. There'll be a little bit of presentation kind of squeezed in for the folks who can't be here so that they can see it on videotape. But for the most part, we're just going to be working together. And the idea is to develop today some new tools that you can use in your searches in order to remediate implicit bias. So we're providing a lot of tools. But the idea with the tools that we create is that these are all in draft form and that you're going to customize them based on your discipline, based on your search, and based on your setting. So think of yourselves today as designers of implicit bias remediation tools. And we're going to spend the next couple hours doing that. I recognize it's not the most convenient time for those who are interested in getting blind or seeing the solar eclipse. I looked at it earlier, and that was maybe not the right thing to do. So feeling a little dizzy. But if you find yourselves drawn to the outdoors, just feel free to come on back. Don't leave us. And we will be taking breaks periodically. So if you find yourself using that break time to run outside, that's fine. Keep yourself safe. So we have quite a bit to go over, so I'm going to actually jump on in with some introductions. So thank you for the invitation, Leanne, to be back. And my background is in organizational learning and facilitation, and more recently on racial justice explicitly in higher education. And I think I'm working in about 7 institutions now that are working on equity across the state. I'm going to give Roman a moment. He's helping make sure everyone's got what they need, so he'll introduce himself momentarily. But you'll see him at the faculty convocation A couple days. Is it called a convocation? Retreat. Retreat. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of get us here, and then we're going to do some introductions. Okay, everyone's going to introduce themselves. So this statement, does this look familiar? Will someone like to read it? Anybody? It's going to be about, yeah, go ahead. Oh, here, have a mic.
Is it because I'm junior faculty? We are committed to an inclusive learning and work environment that values individual differences and respects each person's dignity. We strive to open our doors to students and employees from all walks of life and to assist them once they arrive. Many of our students are the first in their families to attend college. Their insights add greatly to the overall educational experience.
Have to give it a minute. Okay, so it hasn't moved the nation. I think most of us would agree that philosophy and that good intent hasn't actually resolved the issues that we have around equity. And so while today's on implicit bias, I want to just mention that there's a tremendous amount of explicit bias, and that we're in a moment of resurging more public explicit bias. And so sometimes implicit bias, I think, is seen as the more polite of the two topics, because folks, we all share implicit bias, and it's something that largely we're not conscious of. But I think it's important just to note that we have lots of bias to grapple with at the moment, both implicit and explicit. So in hiring in particular, implicit bias can be a little bit insidious. So that's why we're taking a couple hours today to make sure we understand it, we can remediate it. But I think it's important to note the kind of the moment that we're in, and how critical I think we can kind of redouble our efforts to address the issues related to equity. So we're departing from color blindness as a paradigm, and instead we're going to do three things today. One is familiarize ourselves with implicit bias. What are we talking about? How can it manifest in hiring? And many of you may have that background knowledge already, so I ask you to bear with us. What we can never get enough of is practice, strategies, things to do to interrupt them. And then also, we have some additional tools we haven't handed out, but we will at the end of the day, and you're welcome to take with you. One is kind of an opportunity for you to reflect on your own social network and in your classroom, so you have an opportunity to think not only of implicit bias in the context of hiring, but in the context of your practice as instructors or administrators. And then also, if you are finding yourself still a bit skeptical, a whole host of resources where you can take the implicit bias test and get more of the research behind implicit bias. So those are two resources you can take with you. All right, so I'll introduce the center, and then I'll have Roman introduce himself. So the Center for Urban Education focuses on socially conscious research, and that's why I said we're all going to be designing research tools, because we do applied research. So we take it that applied research is one of the best strategies in higher education to create change, and so that's our approach. And Roman, do you want to introduce yourself? I'm going to...
Yeah, sure.
And maybe you could be the holder of the other mic.
Yeah, thank you, Deanna. As Deanna mentioned, my name is Roman Liera. I'm a PhD student at the University of Southern California, but I'm also a research assistant at the Center for Urban Education. So I've been very lucky to be able to be part of the process as well. So I've been learning a lot. So part of my dissertation is learning about Cal Lutheran. So Deanna had mentioned that on Wednesday I'm going to present some of the data that myself and another PhD student collected about the experiences of faculty of color. So I look forward for Wednesday and seeing many of your faces, if not your faces again.
Great. All right. So, and then I'm just going to ask everyone to kind of quickly go around the table. You probably, maybe you know each other, maybe you don't, but just on the off chance that you don't, give yourselves an opportunity to say good morning to each other and maybe share a thing that you want to get out of today, really briefly, with each other at your table. So anybody can start, and it'll just be an opportunity for you to introduce yourselves to your table mates and one thing you want to get out of today.
What? Yeah.
All right, we're gonna come back together in about 2 minutes. So just start wrapping up. Yeah, it's right now. No, but it's today. You gonna go check it out?
You keeping busy? Yes.
Oh my God, this is the first I know. I know, even with the glasses, right? Yeah, I know. No, even with the glasses, it works. It's a powerful thing. Plastic is not solution. Should I sing? Oh, that would have been good too. It's awesome. All right. You can get maybe I think everybody's happy. We had our moment of I know, everyone's I know. Yeah. I really liked it. Hard to get academics during a celestial moment. Okay. I think we're coming back. All right. Now I feel like we can really get started now. We've had our moment in the sun. All right. So coming back together, I'm going to walk us through the agenda very briefly. So what are we going to be doing? We did welcome introductions. Great, did that. Table intros, done. All right, we're going to talk very momentarily about equity at CLU and kind of the state of affairs, particularly in terms of student outcomes. We've got a little bit of data, not much. And then we're going to get into a little bit more about implicit bias, definitions, and some dialogue. And then on your table, we're going to be grabbing materials. And I recognize they're all kind of look similar, so it may take us a minute to sort it out. And folks in the back may not have enough, so as you get yours, we'll make sure we redistribute resources to the back of the room where they didn't, I don't think they have enough. And we're going to use those resources to unpack examples of bias. So we're going to do a little reading, just a little tiny bit of reading, and start discussing some letters on the table. You have 2 examples of letters from candidates. We're going to be doing a bit of a document analysis, so everybody should have, and it looks like we're doing it now, so everybody should have 1 copy of either a Jake letter or a Robert letter, so one or the other, and you can have one or the other, but not both. You're going to be pairing up, so I know, isn't that nice? Half the reading you would have had. Half the reading. Okay, but you are going to have to pair up a Robert and a Jake reviewer, so make sure you've got someone kind of close to you who's got the other. Everybody's going to need an analysis sheet that looks like this. It's a table, and it's under sunglasses on some tables. Everybody's going to need one of those. And if we're short, well, I think Chris is making more copies. Everyone is going to need a handout that says Building Equity in Faculty Hiring at the top, and one that says Implicit Bias at the top. And there should be enough of those for everyone. Ramon, if you have any extras, please hand them to Ramon as he makes his way around the room, and he'll be collecting them. So maybe we'll start up here. Do you have any extras? Extras in the middle, in the mush pot? Okay, great. All right. There are two similar looking handouts. One has red on the top and one doesn't. You've got a whole full pack. You don't have one? Or you miss it? Okay. Do you have one? Open that. Oh, the evaluation? That's okay. You have that. You don't have this. No, just one or the other. Okay, we're not going to start reading yet. We got a little collective sense making to do, but I'm glad people are thinking ahead. Okay, so if you don't have what you need, we'll make sure you do by the time you need it. So we're going to turn our attention to the front of the room, and quickly just say, what do I mean when I say equity, right? So what do I mean when I say equity? So equity at the center is defined a number of different ways, but one of the ways it's defined is representational equity. And so in representational equity, this is thinking particularly in terms of your student population. And when you have a student population of a certain demographic, right, you could map it. So let's say in the incoming class for this year, does anyone know what the percentage of Latino students is for the fall of 2017? 31%. All right, this is pretty close. All right, so imagine that said 31%. Let's say 4 years from now, 5 years from now, you'd want to make sure you had a graduation rate pretty close to 31%, right? That would be representational equity in outcomes. So that's one way to define equity. And so when we have inequity, it's kind of a flag. Maybe something's not working quite as well as it could be. And so it points us in the direction of inquiry, figuring out what's not working, and maybe looking, and in our work, particularly at our practices. So at CLU, this is from 2015, graduation rates. So you can see that there's a range by race and ethnicity. And what stands out to you? Kind of calculated the equity gaps. What do you notice, if anything? Right, so black students have a pretty significant equity gap here, which could say something about, is the institution serving black students as well as it might be serving other student groups? What else jumps out? Right, unknown, right? So there's trends. So what you don't have here are raw numbers, right? So this is not a super duper helpful chart. You don't know how many people are represented in each of these. So you don't really know exactly what to make of it. But yeah, you could look at trend data and say, are the numbers of students that are identifying as unknown increasing, decreasing, and who typically would mark race or ethnicity unknown? You could do some inquiry into that. Yeah. Okay.
So this says it's comparing to the highest performing group. But the highest performing group is American Indians, not white.
Right. Okay. So the reason that I didn't compare it to highest performing group, you're right, is because of the numbers. So I excluded groups that were probably, statistically, or in terms of representation, folks might be more skeptical. It should probably be edited. See, we're already remediating my tools. Perfect. I think that was a helpful question. Yes, sir.
I presume this is undergraduate only, right?
You know, that is another good question. I believe it is undergraduate only. It's from iPads. Yeah, so it's undergraduate. So it just gives you a sense that maybe, you know, there's some work to be done. And as many of you know, it may be difficult to draw a direct line between that data and implicit bias, but there's definitely maybe a relationship or a conversation to have about the role of implicit bias on the campus and how it may be impacting outcomes for students, outcomes for faculty, and outcomes in hiring. And so I provided that just to kind of, again, set the stage for the conversation. So how many folks here have done an implicit bias training already or something similar? All right, so you know what implicit bias is by definition. It's basically, that stereotypes are paired up in our unconscious and that we operate off of those with some regularity, and particularly when they're triggered by certain conditions. So it's often, when we're making an assessment of competence, that we unfortunately draw on those implicit biases, and that they can be positive or negative. They're not just negative, right? We can associate positive things with people. This is something that has served us well in our evolution, right? Pairing. So when we came in today, we didn't have to sort out what is this, how do you use it, right? This general shape in our mind is already associated with what? Chair. But when we do it with people, it's problematic. So we're really speaking in terms of our cognitive frames. And our cognitive frames really shape how we see reality, right? The questions that we ask each other, how we make sense of problems, how we make sense of what's a priority, is all a function of our cognitive frames, of which implicit bias is kind of an element. Anybody have any issue with that so far? Okay, so let's just look at a couple examples. All right, so here's one from Katrina. So what do y'all see? This was from the AP, right, and AFP. So how might this be an example of implicit bias? What do you see? Yes, sir.
So, full disclosure, I use this example in my class.
Oh my God, he already uses this example.
So the problem one makes those kinds of white people seem incredibly resourceful and civically minded.
Yeah.
Whereas the gentleman on the top is a sort of criminal element who's apparently stealing something from the store in the middle of the film.
Okay. Seems to be a general. All right, so our use of language is oftentimes very revealing, right, in terms of our implicit biases. How we characterize situations and people can give us insight into implicit bias. All right, here's another one. How might this be helpful in understanding implicit bias? Right. Cognitive dissonance makes us laugh. Ah, it's so funny. Also, it's Snoop and Martha, so yeah, they're enduring figures of American culture and good friends, right? For those of you who are Snoop and Martha followers. All right, so already we've had kind of an experiential kind of moment of implicit bias, which is part of the reason I'm not going to go into a big argument about the fact that it exists. But just to kind of drive the point home, we're going to play a game. All right, have you ever played this game? All right, so this is a game where you're going to practice saying colors and not words, okay? And the purpose of this game, and it was created by Jerry Kong, who's at the UCLA office where they look at diversity and equity, is to kind of demonstrate again how quickly our mind pairs things that it associates with one another, right? So we pair words and colors pretty closely together. And so this game is going to help demonstrate that fact. All right. So, but we're gonna beat the game. I'm sure we'll be the folks who beat it. All right. So the way you play the game is we're going to start together at column 1, and we're going to read down, and we're going to read just the color, forget the words or the letters. Right. We're going to ignore those. And just for those who are a little bit color challenged, this is purple, and this is blue. All right, because they're pretty close. All right. So are we ready? I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, all right? 1, 2, 3. Green, red, purple, green, blue, yellow, blue, red. green, yellow, red, purple. Great. All right, we're going to do it one more time. All right, you ready? All right, let's see how we do. All right, 1, 2, 3. Green, red, purple, green, blue, yellow, red, green, yellow, red, purple. Woohoo! We are so ready for the last one. You ready? All right, 1, 2, 3, let's go. Green, red, purple, green, blue, yellow, red, green, yellow, red, purple. Woo! We made it. Yes, sir. It wouldn't, and that's a different kind of issue, right? So this does not accommodate everyone, right? But I'm sure we could do some other kind of pairing tests. In fact, the Harvard implicit bias test, have any of you ever taken that test? Essentially operates off the same idea. It pairs pictures of people with words, and some of the words are complimentary words, and some of the words are derogatory words, right? And it really just looks at the speed at which you're able to sort faces with words based on the ethnicity of those faces that you perceive. And there are other kinds of implicit bias that it also will allow you to test yourself on in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of other things. So this is the science in a way that helps establish that implicit bias is about hesitation, at least, at a minimum, and at worst, it's about the lack of hesitation, the willingness to just pair things indiscriminately in a way. Due to our culture. So the way that we develop these implicit biases is grounded, it's very culture specific, and because of our culture being very stratified in terms of race, and a lot of history of segregation and stereotypes, we have in some ways similar, if not the same, implicit biases despite our values. So you can be very egalitarian and you can still operate off of implicit bias, negative implicit biases, or positive. Even people from a group, so women, I still will have biases, against women, even though I am a woman, right? So it can be against my own self-interest. And then finally, we talked about them being activated unintentionally. So part of what we're going to do today, you'll see around the room, we have all these posters, is these are all strategies for how you can interrupt implicit bias. And so these will help us in those situations where we're under pressure, we might be more likely to draw on our implicit biases to not do that. So, how is hiring related to this setting? Like, how might this represent hiring, the hiring process? What do you think?
All those degrees apply.
All of them? Okay, so what would be a lack of how might you encounter a lack of information?
Start with all we have is resume and cover letter.
You start there, right? Lack of information is like the condition of hiring to a certain degree. Anybody else have thoughts on that? Okay. Okay, stress from competing tasks, that's your life, right? And the season of hiring, like when it happens, that might actually, create more stress depending on what else you've got going on. Can you give me an example? Yep.
Let's go back to lack of information.
Yeah.
I think we often think about the candidate when we think about lack of information or being a tool. We also lack information about ourselves and about our context. So like what are we actually hiring for? Well, we think we know when we go into a search, but do we really understand what we're searching for and why?
Right. And you might not have a lot of information about the people you're making decisions with. There could be lots of gaps in our knowledge that would allow us to even operate off of implicit bias with one another, not just the candidates, right? All right, and lack of critical mass, right? So if you only have a few examples of people from a specific, racial or ethnic group, you might not have a good representational sample, and that might also drive you toward using implicit biases. So here's a little research that's been done in the context of hiring. How many of you have seen these resume studies? Pretty common. So the data in this one really looked at the same resume using two different names. So one that was more characteristically African American, Jamal, and Greg, a more characteristically white name. And what you saw in this study was that Jamal had to send an additional 15 resumes to get a callback, right? So, and then, not an additional, we had to send 15 as opposed to Greg's 10. So there's like a third more effort in order to get a callback. Greg yielded more callbacks, and so it took, for Jamal to get as many callbacks, took an additional 8 years of experience on his resume. And while you would think that additional experience would reap additional benefits for the candidate, the Jamal candidate, actually higher resume quality didn't actually yield an increase, as dramatic an increase. So if you can go back to the bar chart there, you can kind of see here that this is a higher quality resume and a higher quality resume, a lower quality and lower quality. So there's just a much more significant gap here than there is here. So that just helps us understand, the implications, even without the intent. The implications are the same. And we do have a colleague, James Gray, who works at the Community College of Aurora, who looked at his own hiring practices after working with us and recognized that statistically, he could not have come up with the results that he did without some intent. He looked at it and he said, on some level, this represents intent on my part. And so he had to unpack his practices and recognize that, yes, in fact, his practices were leading to a particular result, which is that he had all white math faculty. And in a matter of 6 months, he was able to turn it around just by changing his practices. All right. So here's one last bit of information. This is kind of other characteristics that you might find. So search committees often will respond more positively if they know the writers of letters, right? And they're more familiar with them. They'll evaluate those candidates higher. Not based on the content of the letters, just their familiarity with the writers of the letters. And that both black men and women in general, are asked much more personal questions in the context of interviews. All right. So how does implicit bias look? So it might look like these things. So one is confirmation bias, right? So if you have a preconceived notion about a particular group or person, you might want to confirm that through the process. So I'm a UCLA graduate. If somebody applies and is a UCLA graduate, I might think that confirms my positive bias toward UCLA graduates. So I might have a confirmation bias for graduates of the same institution or a similar institution. Other examples of that one folks can think of? Might come up in a particular discipline? Yes?
Beyond just where they actually getting their degree from, I think that there has been a tendency to try to replicate what
Great.
departments would already look like.
Yeah.
So they seek to just replicate, they're a lot of students, and so they're more high quality.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, effective heuristics. So this is something that's like superficial. So it would be a superficial trait that you might prioritize in a search. We do it for presidents all the time. Like height. Yep. Yeah. Height's like you Google somebody and they're tall, you're like, oh, they're very tall. I think, there you go. Very attractive, tall people. That would be an example. Anything else that might come up? Yep. Facial symmetry. Yep, very good.
I was talking to a colleague a couple weeks ago about voice quality and the pitch of a woman's voice in phone interviews, and how there was a particular candidate that had a pretty high-pitched voice, and how that really rubbed the wrong way some of the search committees.
Yeah. What is the vocal, what's that? Fry, right? That's something that I think I have. And there's a way that my voice drops at the end of a sentence that's very unattractive to a lot of people. So I've been told. Anything else? Accent? Mm-hmm. Hairstyle sometimes, Yes. Tattoos, right?
I actually had a colleague here on campus tell me not to call my students
Yeah. You're like, right. You're like, hey. Yeah. Yep.
But this can also go the other way, right?
Yes.
You assume someone's more qualified than they are because of something.
Yes.
So it's not just.
Do you want to give that example? Roman, would you be willing to give the example you gave this morning about your colleague? The professorial one?
Oh, that's right.
So I was talking to some of my cohort members. Some of my cohort members already graduated this past May. There's this one guy, his name is Mike, and I was telling my buddy Eric, who's another Latino, like, Mike, when I look at him, he already looks like a professor, like, and I don't even know why, especially when he was walking down with his cap and gown, like, telling you, Mike looks like a scholar. And then I was telling Deanna, like, I'm aware of these things, and I still think that he looks like a scholar because he's a white male, the way he carries himself, the way he speaks. Even though I think it's an implicit bias, I'm still like, he looks like a scholar, like he's already a professor, he's just got his PhD. So I think that's the example that I was giving Deanna in the morning.
I like that one. Thank you for sharing it. All right, couple more. Expectation anchor. So what would be an expectation anchor that you might use to help rule out or rule in candidates? Yeah. Great. They should have all of their letters of recommendation. It's like a pretty rigid thing. I was thinking like years of experience teaching could be one. Like I think they need to have 5 years. It's kind of arbitrary, right? But it gives me an anchor. Could have disproportionate impact. Yep. I only want to look at, Ivy League graduates or from these regions or these particular, kinds of research, or I'm only interested in this. Any kind of benchmark that may be more related to excluding folks. Yeah.
So, do we apply the converse to say we should include in our searches folks who absolutely don't fit?
I think you have to.
Low quality institutions should be considered anyway, just so we're not.
Well, what you need to do is interrogate the anchor. Like, is this anchor actually serving us to get somebody who is actually going to be able to do this job? Or is this anchor unrelated? So if it's like 5 years of teaching experience, right? So does this job require 5 years of teaching experience? Or is it just that it would make it easier for me not to have to support this person when they come, because I will assume that if they have 5 years of teaching experience, it will be less work, kind of orienting them and supporting them. So it may be that scholars of color in a field that is just beginning to diversify, may not have as much experience. And so you may have to be more flexible on that because you're getting something else, right? So I think it's really looking at how is that anchor serving us and who might it be excluding? And what's it about? Is it about me? Is it about something else? So, and then intuition. That's my favorite because I'm always relying on it, right? My intuition. I just feel good about that person, or I feel like that person's kind of creepy. And oftentimes this is raced. I was in a room with a woman the other day, and she had almost no affect, and she was Latina, and I thought, am I responding to her as a white woman, who comes into spaces quite easily and safely, right? And she had a very different affect, and I realized that I needed to account for the fact that she's going into spaces often where it's not hospitable, right? And she has to mediate those spaces, and so she's developed a certain strategy. She was extremely competent, really, very well rehearsed, knew her stuff, very powerful person, but her affect was a little bit different, and I had to kind of stop myself in the intuition thing and say, like, this is a person who has a very different lived experience, and so I may be experiencing something of that. And so I need to account for that and my own bias, right, as a white woman. That was really, it was helpful. It's a relief, actually, when you start doing this because you realize, okay, I don't really know exactly what I'm talking about. I need to slow down. All right, so these are ones that came up during the CLU project, so we thought you might be interested in them. So folks were asked to brainstorm what kind of comes up in committees. And so oftentimes the issue of fit, right? A greater willingness to have dinner with white candidates, concern about accent, somebody brought that up, stalling with an offer when a candidate of color was a finalist, tensions between department needs and campus needs, right? So are we hiring somebody who's going to improve our status as an HSI, provide resources that aren't currently available to the campus? Are we just hiring for ourselves? And what we perceive as being our priorities. You know, there are now questions, right, and there's rubrics to ask about diversity in particular and how folks will work on that, but how you ask and what you agree is a sufficient response could be an indication of bias. Yeah, expectations around candidates that come from urban communities, what they'd be happy with. Kind of exchanging all candidates who are African American, Latino, Native American as being interchangeable, or just generally having a positive bias. And, you know, as Roman mentioned, even as people who do this work, you might find yourself having a bias toward white male candidates, and so you have to, again, slow your roll. All right. Does this look familiar? Yeah? Okay. Well, that's you. That's probably why. All right. So we're going to do a little work. So we mentioned earlier that there are these handouts. So the one on the left that says implicit bias, I'd ask that everybody grab that one. And we're going to walk through some solutions. And if you don't have one, you can look on your buddies. But it looks like this. It's got the red logo at the top. Anybody need one? Okay, great. Yep, I think I stole yours. Okay. So what do we do? All right, there should be Post-it notes. If there's not, you're going to be thinking about things you could do to remediate bias in these particular areas. So I think what I'm going to do is have you read just the first page here, and I'm going to go over it very briefly, and then talk for a few moments with the, you know, kind of the person next to you or a couple people about some things that you could imagine yourself doing. And if you don't have Post-it notes, what I'm going to do is come around and you can either stick them up yourself if you see it, or you can collect them. But the idea here is to really retrain your brain, right? Stereotype replacement, counter-stereotypic imaging is really about seeking out examples that are maybe not within your experience or your discipline's experience. Individuation, right? So really thinking about individuals and not making decisions about those individuals based on you know, your ideas about the group. So thinking about, like I just did a minute ago, you know, how might a Latina experience things differently from me, and how might that influence the way that I'm, you know, she's engaging with me at this moment. So really taking up, and I recognize that can be a little tricky, but if you have colleagues, they can help you. And then increasing opportunities for contact. So later today, we're going to hand out some homework, and in that homework, the questions have to do with things like, who do you usually sit next to at your department meetings? Who do you go to when you need advice? And then what's the faculty, staff, and administrative composition of your department? So, you know, if you are surrounding yourselves with people who are generally like you, of course, that's going to, you know, increase your likelihood to have biases against folks who aren't. So increasing contact is one of the things you can do to help yourself. So just take those and start to think about a few things you might do. And if you think of some things as practice, write them on a Post-it note. And then we're going to do a little activity in about, I don't know, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. We're going to float. Yes.
These activities you end up like on a search.
Yes, exactly. On a search committee with your colleagues. Or in preparation, like a few minutes. Yeah, it does go on the back, so if you want to read ahead, that's fine. It's not too overwhelming. That's it. Lots of choices.
I would actually add like perspective too. So viewing the world from that adversary, here's a thing I've seen come up. So like someone actually goes through this and visualizes something. So seeing the world from that, and then they kind of talk through that, and then they turn around and say, yeah, but that's not exactly rational because blah, 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 blah. Does that make sense? So they try to kind of give a perspective. They try to argue that way as if, like, somehow it doesn't make sense.
Arguing the perspective of the lawyer or arguing
Right.
that
So
we
trying
can't,
to understand
we can't
perspective. But
give
then,
another perspective.
It's here's the other perspective, and then this is why I can't. So
so thinking of
this is the way she sees things, and she's just being emotional.
Earlier one where she talked about going in and having the person who has face which wasn't
Right, this one is
as much emotion, and then say, oh, I understand where she comes from, but that's going to be a problem because they're really cross. So you kind of see it, and then you come up with a place to go in why it's not the word she
So you sort of step in those shoes a little bit.
but then you argue.
Oh, that's absolutely.
One of the dynamic comes from one of the original factors for the implicit bias, which is occupancy. So trying to imagine someone else's point of view is an exercise in imagination, which, and if you don't have much to go on, then you have to figure out if you really are more thinking in your head that may or may not be good.
And then if you go further, probably if you push that to the side, then you're also still not in a position to put them aside.
Right, so you're having a mono experience.
Right.
It's actually disconnected.
It pertains to the thinking slow.
I mean, for example, their So I was interested that she made an assessment about what it would be based on color, but actually it might be a different kind of difference. Yeah. So, yeah. You just have to be aware.
For example, like one of those research that spoke English, I think spoke English. Latino accent, as a person who just learned like, if someone said, well, he's been here for 20 years, why have we progressed so further? That might be a sign of something else in the public. So, my impression is, well, this is for as opposed to the way we might have said it. It's just sounds interesting.
So we're going to come back together briefly to tease out a couple complexities. All right, so up till now it's been pretty kind of straightforward. Boop-a-doop-a-doo, this is what it is. But as you can see, even in the examples of what you're being asked to do, there are some tensions, right? So you're being asked to individuate, right? So think of people as individuals. You're also being asked to kind of group people sufficiently to be able to empathize with what potentially might be stereotypes that they're having to deal with, right? So there's a bit of a tension between the idea of grouping in order to get to equity and the idea of individuation, right? So that's one tension. The other is the mental model that's driving the discrimination doesn't fit for everyone in our kind of contemporary intersectional cultures, right? Where people may see themselves as biracial, or they may be biracial, or they may live in much more progressive spaces. And so the conflict over having to think about this topic, despite the fact that in their own lives they feel like they've transcended it, right? Or that because of demographic shifts we should have transcended it. So I just want to put those on the table because there are a couple things that came up that recognize this is not easy. This is not a checklist. It's not just something you're going to be able to fix. It's a nuanced practice. And the other thought that I think was raised is, what are we seeking? Like perfection? Like absolutely no bias? And the idea here is to really start to kind of address more egregious examples, right? So making sure you can kind of identify egregious examples and address them productively so that you have the practice with the language to interrupt. Because one of the other things we talked about at CLU is kind of the culture of niceness, right? And that it can be kind of difficult with our colleagues to, kind of interrogate something they might say. And also that within hiring committees you have power dynamics that also might be difficult to navigate. So I just wanted to say I recognize this as a complex challenge. So we're going to keep practicing. I would like to ask everyone to maybe take a 5-minute stretch break, and then we're going to come back at 10 after, and we're going to read one of these 2 letters and do a little more practice. So, but before you start reading, I think you should stretch. So if you need a stretch break or a restroom break, this is your chance. Come on back at 10 after. It's just a 5-minute break. We're going to come back together. All righty, you ready? Are you ready to learn? Are you ready? There's an Eclipse song, right? A total eclipse of the heart. This mic is inspiring me with the orange. All right, we're coming back. Here we are. Okay, so what you're gonna do now is you're gonna pick a partner. Okay, you're gonna pick a partner, and if there's an odd number of folks at your table, you're gonna have a group of 3. And you're each going to choose a letter. So you're either going to get the Robert letter or the Jack letter. So pick one or the other. All right, this is like role play time. Okay? And you're going to read one or the other letter for the next 5 minutes. You are going to circle. You're going to circle what stands out to you as attractive. And keep in mind, it's going to be very interesting to see, given what we've been talking about, what stands out to you. And you're going to underline anything that looks like it might raise concern. Okay? Yes? As a committee, so as a member of a committee, recognize you're going to be straddling identities here, right? You're going to be straddling your equity identity, your department identity, maybe an outside reviewer identity, right? Anybody have other questions for clarity? All right. On your mark, get set, go. All right, we're going to come back together. And so this is the time when you're going to grab your worksheet, that little table that you have. And Roman and I are going to do a little role play. This is the dramatization portion of today. And we're going to kind of role play the conversation you might have discussing these letters, okay? And you're going to look for forms of bias, right, on the first column that you can note that we're using, if any. And then you can think about and we're going to actually try to demonstrate some remediation. All right? It's not working. We got to turn it off. Oh, maybe it's that. Let's see. Go testing. Okay. You ready? All right. Okay, action. Hey, Ramon.
Hey, yeah.
So, I'm a little bit curious what you're thinking about these candidates.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I am too. I think I read both of them, Jake and Robert, cover letter, and then some of the few things that pop out on Jake's don't pop out for me, and Robert's cover letter.
Like what?
Well, I think one of the things that pops out from Jake is that he did get his doctorate from Harvard, but not just that. He went for a postdoctoral at the University of Michigan, which seems pretty prestigious.
It's very prestigious.
Right. However, I go back and forth, right? Because knowing that we just became a Hispanic service institution, Robert's cover letter sticks out.
Jake doesn't mention that at all. Like he doesn't even really get into like how, I mean, he talks about being successful as a teacher and one-on-one supervising with doctoral students, but I wonder, if his background in Scandinavian countries is going to resonate.
I mean, historically, California Lutheran is
Scandinavian.
Right.
That's right.
Maybe.
So maybe that would be.
He fits into our culture.
I know he probably would, and they're the nicest people on the planet.
Right. Right. No, but I think in terms of considering the type of work that they could bring, I think Robert, his work specifically, because he seems to be informed by his own experiences, first generation college student. And then I think a lot of his research comes out of that, right? Love focusing on undocumented students, Latino students, and maybe that's a new aspect for our department in school education.
I know. Do you think he would fit, though? I mean, he might make us uncomfortable with all that talk of microaggressions.
Well, I think considering the current situation where we are, I think that's a very important conversation to have.
And it's on the rubric, actually, that we have for evaluating candidates, like
Right.
how equipped they are
Right.
with dealing with, situations and how they can coach us and students. So.
Right.
What I noticed also is I know the Susan, who's recommending, she's supervising Jake, but I don't know Marcella. So, what could we do about that?
Yeah, well, some of the things that I was thinking about, I actually looked up his advisor at the University of Texas San Antonio. So she does actually a lot of amazing work around Latino population, especially localized in Texas. Considering that there are different states, but there's a large population here in California as well.
I'm so glad you did that. You really went out of your way.
Yeah, I mean, I really like this cover letter. I think it brings a new perspective. It is very detailed in terms of the research, and also he talks about a lot of his own experience, not just teaching, but also mentoring students.
Well, I think our committee might struggle a little bit with differentiating, these different, so maybe we're going to need to bring in some some counter-stereotypical exemplars from the field as a way to prime, maybe the committee to think a little bit differently about, because some of these things for Jake, they just really pop off the page.
Right.
So we might have to think a little more about how to prepare ourselves, like get really clear what's the job.
Right. That's true. What are some of the things that pops out for you?
Well, talking to you is really helping because I'm realizing that for what we need, Robert brings something that we could really use in our department. So I think we're going to need to really use that rubric, and be much more deliberate and maybe not do it right between, a bunch of meetings. Because I've already been approached by a few people about Jake, and I know they're real excited.
Yeah.
So I think we might have to slow down and take some time.
Right.
All right. It's good talking to you.
Yeah, it was good talking.
All right. All right, so now you're going to pair up, and each of you take a Jake and a Robert and kind of see what did you circle, what did you underline, and what might that say about some biases that are creeping in. All right, give yourselves like 2 more minutes to wrap up. Okay, coming back together. Hello. Alrighty. Alrighty. So, yes. Oh, that was camaraderie. This was the sign of camaraderie. Okay, so we have 2 things we're going to do before we leave. One is discuss how that was and see if you came up with anything for your chart. So I know you're talking, which is good, that was the point, but if you're listening to folks, you could fill this out. What I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, is collect these from you at the end of the day along with your evaluation, and I can type them up and then provide them back to you as a tool. Right? So if you can identify an example of a bias, how it might disproportionately impact candidates of color, specifically Latino, African American, Native American, Asian Pacific Islander candidates, and then how you could minimize the bias. I'll collect them, type them up, get them back to you. Okay? And we'll also collect your Post-it notes, and I'll type those up as well. All right? So, but we need to fill it in together. So, did anybody find themselves having any bias that emerged out of their review of either letter that they'd be willing to share in your discussion? Yes?
I had Robert, and my bias was that he was from Bozeman, Montana. Cost of living.
Cost of living, great. Okay, so the example of the bias would be that, going back to those previous ones, right, that we kind of jump. So let's see. Boop-a-doo. So maybe would you say that was an expectation anchor, maybe, or intuition, something like that? Or it's more reasonable than that, isn't it? You're like, this is a reasonable concern. This is not a bias. Maybe it's not individuation. We haven't asked him, right? He did apply. He knows he's an intelligent human being, right? He applied. Probably looked up the cost of living. Okay, so that's a great one. You're like, maybe he didn't. Maybe he doesn't know what he's doing. He can't Google. All right. Okay, so the example of bias. What's another one? So what could we do about that if that came up for you? How might that disproportionately impact a candidate of color, saying somebody won't move from X to Y, whatever the X is? How? You might not move them forward in the process because you would assume, right? So because Thousand Oaks is not a diverse community, you can imagine that most candidates that you would want to recruit to make this a much more diverse campus wouldn't be coming necessarily from communities like this, right? It's kind of like a chicken and egg thing or something. So you might need to set that one aside, right, as a collective and say, no, we're definitely going to be recruiting candidates from communities that are very distinct from the community that we live in. And what are we going to do? And we talked a little bit about this with the evidence team, right? Like, what are we going to do to ensure their success once they get here? Right? Shifting the onus from them onto the campus. So that could be something you could do, is really put in place strategies to make sure that folks coming from Bozeman have what they need when they get here. Then it wouldn't worry. That's right. Not so different, right? Yep. Thank you for coming. What else? Yes. Here.
My concern with Jake is that he was potentially overqualified in looking at his educational experience.
Okay. Anybody else have that? Yep. You had it? Yep. So is that the kind of bias we're worried about at this moment? Like like we said, we have positive biases and negative biases, right? And we're trying to figure out, like, what are we doing, right? So when we have a bias that maybe this person's overqualified, it is still a bias. It may be some of these same brain mechanisms are at play, right? But is it going to disproportionately impact him as a potential candidate of African American, Latino, Asian, Pacific Islander, or Native American descent? Because that's the kind of bias we're trying to remediate. Yeah.
One way that I think that can manifest is if you have somebody who's overqualified or seems to be slightly critical already, then you think if you're going to offer them the job, they're going to take 2 to 3 weeks to answer, and then you're going to lose out on all your other candidates. So overqualified or there, you could read in some criticism into Robert's discussion, personal beliefs that bias does contribute to dealing with students and hiring. So that could actually come into it.
I understand. So it sounds like totally different things. One is you might have a candidate who you think is highly desirable, and maybe you would make the offer, and because they have so many other offers, they would take time, and that would slow the process down, and that could mean that you want to go with somebody who's a little bit more of a quote-unquote fit. And if that person were a person of color, then that would actually be detrimental. Yeah.
Okay, I hope I didn't lose the train here, but
With the Jake letter,
Yeah.
right, I wound up reading both Robert and Jake, and we talked about them, but I had the same reaction to Jake. Not only is he overqualified, but he doesn't appear to be a good fit for this institution because he's so research focused. And I don't see anything in the letter about relating to students more broadly or being at a small liberal arts college. So let me just say that I've been on two hiring committees. One hiring committee at CLU where a faculty, an interviewee who was Latino did not get hired because they had Jake's resume.
That's what I was wondering.
So that's the concern.
We're just going to have to talk. We're going to go to Sheridan. We'll come over. We might have to talk without a microphone. Go ahead.
So I just wanted to make a point that's not necessarily specific to the details in the letter, but I'm concerned about the language we're using because I don't know what overqualified means for CLU. Like, who's too good for us? And what does that say about who we think we are as faculty if we look at a resume and say, this person is so much better than I am, they won't come to our campus. We won't move them to the next step. I can't conceptualize what overqualified means. Now, there's all kinds of other reasons why they may not best serve our university mission, they may not best serve our student population, the needs of the department in terms of what courses need to be taught, but overqualified as a broad brushstroke about a CV, to me, I can't conceptualize what that means.
I think we were having the same thing as that we automatically assume because we're an R01 institution that they might not feel that they might not want to come here, but we forget that most of us did actually come from R01s, and that we're not overqualified, that we have an inferiority complex if we're looking for Harvard and all of a sudden we're thinking, oh, they're too good for us. No, they're applying for the position, so they want to be here. So that's the way I kind of look at it. The second thing is that looking at Jake's CV or Jake's letter, to me it kind of potentially screamed ABD. You know, that you're on an R01 institution and that's the trajectory and you don't have a good mentor to be able to tell you that you're going to go to a liberal arts, you need to investigate it more and write that into your letter. So to me, it was more like a ABD person as opposed to a experienced person, and I think that's a bias as well, that we look at these letters, we see a lot of research, and it may be that they are just very, very young and junior in their career, and that's what they've been trained to write, as opposed to understanding where they want to go.
I just want to call our attention to the second column and the third column. So we're talking about folks that we might consider overqualified. Is this happening, do you think generally, because you gave an example, I'm wondering across searches, is that the problem? Is that the thing that's making it difficult for you to hire faculty, candidates of color?
Sorry.
I think the overqualified question is a very good one. There are several ways we can actually work towards that. One is that we have to do our searches in a timely manner. Secondly, if you think that a person would really take another offer, from the time you start, from the time you come to make a decision, the person may take another job, so it won't really clog up your system if you really do your work in a timely way. And this guy, by the way, is a postdoctorate, so he's not an ABD. So when I read the postdoctorate, it was comforting because he has a PhD, which is great. So you don't have to really work for that if you are asking for a PhD. So I totally agree with you about overqualified to be defined in a functional way, not in an imaginary way.
So one of the things that I noticed is that we're talking about somebody being overqualified as a postdoc. They're a postdoc. They're not overqualified to be at Cal Lutheran. And one of the things that I noticed was that, are we thinking that they're overqualified because they came from Harvard and from the University of Michigan versus Robert, whose letter I also read, who doesn't throw those names out. And if we're being honest, we compare. When we're on searches, we compare the candidates. We don't go and read them in a silo and then completely erase our minds and then go read Roberts. We're comparing the two. So how are we thinking that Jake is overqualified as a postdoc coming from the University of Michigan, whereas Robert, who has 10 years experience, we've never said is overqualified?
But my question is, if we switch their background, let's say Robert Reyes is from Harvard, what do you think about that?
Well, I think if Robert Reyes wrote that letter, I think you would have some of the same questions about why is he not addressing the HSI status, what makes him qualified to teach the students at this institution. So the idea that by function of the fact that someone's ethnicity is Latino, African American, we talked about this, that the idea of having a matrix was to be able to unpack people's qualifications and really delineate what does it look like to be a good teacher in this environment with the students that you have. What are the kinds of experiences and dispositions that they would need to have? And so you have, on the one hand, you want to diversify your colleagues, that's the goal. And you also want to make sure the folks you bring have the dispositions needed to be able to serve your students. Yeah.
Just based on what I'm hearing, we're all assuming that Robert is a person of color, but we're also assuming that Jake is not. And so I would think that would perhaps be an assumption we could challenge, is that there is nothing that Jake has said that allows us to know that he is a white man.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Well, I found out what's most important in this situation was the environment that the individuals are coming into. And I mentioned that this is a Santa Barbara, Ventura County, a lot of farm workers, a lot of Latinos, et cetera, and so on. So my stereotypical bias here was that, well, now here's an individual who's involved with these, talking about undocumented work and so on. So immediately I felt that this person was more qualified and a better fit than the other person who didn't mention this at all.
Yeah.
So I was just going on geography of where the school is located as my bias that I like to straighten out.
Thank you.
I was just thinking that, and we have in search committees I've been involved in addressed these issues by creating the appropriate rubric. If you have these different categories, and what Greg just pointed out is one of the categories on your rubric, this helps. I guess that's a methodology to eliminate or to combat biases, and any which way, any way you want to look at those biases. So I think, and maybe it was you guys that taught us how to better design our rubrics. I don't know.
Yeah, I think improving the conditions of decision making, one of those would be probably first. We're going to start talking about this. All right, so maybe we'll just start talking. Go ahead.
I was just going to say one of the things that we discussed was not having the job ad in front of us.
Yeah.
Why are people talking about certain things? We could read whatever we wanted to that, but without having the job ad, it really becomes hard, right? I mean, if they were specifically asked to talk about HSI stuff and then Jack didn't, then that would ding him, right? And that would be a plus for the other, et cetera. So that would, I think, improve the conditions of decision making. That having that would have been helpful.
Yeah. Who else? Go ahead.
So if I can add one specific detail out of Jake's letter, not about, maybe it goes to the overqualification. He says, my work has many important implications for state and federal higher educational policies. He's a postdoc. So that smacks to me of overconfidence, over belief in his own efficacy. I'm not sure what it means, but it felt more self-centered than it should have been in a letter where you're just trying to introduce yourself and come across well. And that's what I was reacting to.
So let's
Nothing to do with gender, race, ethnicity, or anything else. Just that statement in a letter is
let's use
annoying.
that as a really productive jumping off point to think about. If there was something that just kind of struck you as kind of slightly offensive, right, in a letter, and let's assume that's maybe more likely to happen with someone who's different from you, right? How might you interrogate yourself around that impulse? Yeah.
So one way might be making the implicit explicit, right? Like the point of, I know Vlad had mentioned, the point of the committees is we could have these conversations, and so if Paul sees that and it really just sticks in his craw, but maybe have a conversation with the committee, and if there's an equity advocate or sort of other people on the committee who can, that turns into a productive conversation and not just an internal monologue.
So if you say, I think he sounds arrogant, right, how can you respond to a colleague who says, I think this candidate seems arrogant? Let's imagine it's a Latina. having that dialogue? Yeah. Great. All right, yes. Right. But sometimes it's tone, right? It's an issue of tone. It's not really the content. It's just like this person doesn't quite fit my idea of what they should fit. And so I'm having a negative reaction. Yes.
Well, another way to look at these letters are in terms of purpose, calling, community building, and those are three really essential things for us. Research, very important to us, but teaching maybe actually more so. So actually both letters emphasize the research first and the teaching comes later. One is significantly more passionate and more hands-on, and the other one seems rather abstract and working with models and positive political economic data. So it's really not, actually both of them represent certain sectors.
So we're going to, thank you. So so we're going to switch gears a little bit because we're about 9 more minutes. So let's kind of do a little bit of an analysis of the last 2 hours. Like what worked about this conversation? What worked about this workshop? And what could have been better? Yeah, about today. What worked so far? Because this is about kind of what worked about this and what could have been better. Yep.
For me, I want to place the emphasis on the inquiry that you started out with. Right? This is about a process of inquiry, and it's engaging that inquiry and using the tools that are available to do the inquiry, both in terms of like the candidates that we're going to be evaluating, but also in terms of our processes.
Okay.
To focus on that. There isn't necessarily one outcome, but it's about engaging this kind of inquiry as a way to transform our practice.
All right, we're going to go around this way. Yep.
So increasing the awareness of the complexities.
Yep. Yes.
And that there is no really ultimately right answer. That you have to be patient with people opening, realizing, thinking. I was making statements to Lisa and I learned stuff as we were going because of her statements. So it's this process that actually can't really be defined well. You just have to keep doing it. It seems to me, in fact, it's a process that emphasizes flaws and errors first.
Yeah.
Right, so it's not deductive, right? It's a different kind of process. I think patience, openness, willing to admit flaws and impediments. That sounds like a great process.
Yes, in the back.
Just to sort of continue with that a bit, I feel like this is just a continual process of reflection of yourself, and you're constantly updating yourself, constantly having to critically analyze the situation and update accordingly. And it's sort of there's never an end to this. It's just a process of inquiry as a standpoint. Yeah.
Other thoughts? What about some stuff that didn't work? Yes.
I think it's just for me more about context. I think you have to keep in mind that everybody is here for different reasons because they will play different roles as it pertains to the search. So some people are here because they're chair of their search, they're faculty members in this department, they're ART, they're outside members, and it does contextualize why we're here, and I think it's important to remember that.
Yep.
And I just think it's something maybe at the beginning we can clarify that. Just understand it. You all have a specific, I think, a different role to have.
Yeah.
And this kind of connects to my point about these letters too, which is, even if we had the ad in front of us where we were explicit about talk about diversity, how you can work with HSI population, whatever, a lot of these searches are going to be for assistant professors, so we're asking potentially junior faculty to be forthright and candid about diversity or challenges with diversity, whether they have or not. So we have to keep that in mind that maybe some candidates of color don't want to be seen as the angry minority, or likewise, candidates who are white think I don't want to seem like I'm anti-diversity. So we just have to also kind of contextualize that as well.
Great. Yes?
I would say specificity also helps a lot. This can often be kind of a murky concept and very easy to agree with and abstract and very difficult to put in practice.
Yep.
So I think seeing kind of hard examples of the John Paul sort of aligned with a letter and then trying to see, get a feel for what types of real conversations we have as opposed to ideal sort of imaginary ones about how easy everything is to be.
Yeah.
That sounded way more negative than I intended.
No, but I'm wondering, so what you're making me think of in terms of thinking about tools is, could you sit down at the beginning as a committee and almost with your portfolio, right, of the rubric, the job announcement, maybe a sample letter that's not even one of the candidate letters, and say, like, how is this going to work so that we're aligning, like, without even looking at a particular candidate, this job announcement, the rubric, and this material that we have. And use your real lived experience as a meta for an hour, and then get some kind of, like, that body practice, that kind of, and then get into the actual content of the search, so that you actually have a much more relevant conversation than what we could have today. But maybe today could be like a model of what you could do. Yeah.
I think Paul mentioned the beginning of the workshop, actually, I think it's referred to the beginning of because that category of percentages, that actually slowed me down.
The equity stuff? Okay.
That just slowed me down because I spent time thinking about some of the stuff Paul pointed out. And also, I think one needs to clarify the unidentified or the other. I mean, biracial, triracial, we're kind of at a point where these categories, right, are actually, maybe they're still working, but I think between the numbers, the way they're presented, and the categories, it might be kind of nice to think about that chart.
Yeah, and I think that you're raising a really important point, because when we first started at CLU, we talked about diverse candidates as one kind of category, and it included international candidates, folks who'd grown up in the United States of all different ethnicities. It was just kind of called diverse, right? And as we're getting closer to trying to be more precise, I think what I would suggest is you're creating a new language, right? So we've encouraged you to be much more explicit, right? Speak about Latino, African American, but really getting to know so that everybody's familiar, which of our students, which of our faculty are declined to state, or, yeah, because those are things that as an outside person, I'm not going to have as much insight into. But I think having that conversation internally is really critical. Yeah.
I'm sorry if this got said, but for the purposes of us and maybe other smaller teaching-oriented colleges, 2 letters that would help us really unpack our own implicit bias more than these 2 letters would be one letter from a Jake who understands how to speak the small college language. Actually has, like, teaching up front in their letter, actually says they went to a small liberal arts college, so they really understand it, blah, blah, blah. Then you're going to get this potentially bring out that reaction like, oh, Jake fits here. Right?
Yeah.
And then have a candidate, have Robert, have a letter that is, more like from an R1 or more from a larger, or more, who doesn't talk about relating as much to students or to teaching. Like, this is a teaching-focused institution. So the reaction that we talked about briefly to the Jake letter was where we use the word overqualified, which is a misnomer. I think Sheridan made a good point about that. Is he's not a good fit because his career trajectory doesn't match our values, needs, approaches, focus at this.
And even, let's say there's some discussion still to have about that. It may be a distraction. I feel like it was a distraction from our conversation, the degree to which he's kind of an aspirational candidate or not. And I think that you're right. So I think it'd be interesting maybe to find some letters that you've used that we could actually extract from, so they're a little bit more realistic. So maybe we can ask that people submit, really good examples of letters.
That was my point when I said I was on a hiring committee in which I saw a candidate get hired who had that.
We'll do 2 more and then we'll wrap up.
Who had that small college letter.
Yes.
Right? Versus the candidate who had the more R1 international whatever. And the Latino candidate didn't get hired because they weren't speaking the small college in language. Right?
So, you know what, I'm actually, hold those thoughts, only because I know some folks are going to leave, and I want to make sure that they have what we've got left for appreciate the feedback. I really appreciate it. This is another opportunity to give additional feedback, which is just a feedback note to me and to Roman. So please fill that out before you leave. There's just an evaluation form. This activity is much more about thinking about implicit bias in your own domain. So departing from the hiring committee setting, giving yourself a chance to reflect on your professional network and how that might assist you in some counter-stereotypical development. And then also, I provided this for faculty the other day, and I just wanted you to have it in case you find it helpful, which is an opportunity for you to think very specifically in your own setting how you might apply some of these anti-bias strategies with some additional examples. So I just leave that with you as a kind of homework. And then the resource list. So, all right, so as people are filling out their evaluations, we'll take a couple more comments. Yep.
I was just going to add my voice to the more specificity on the letter activity, because without the job ad, we don't know what we're looking for. And we've got a lot of different faculty populations and different searches we've been on before. And so one of the first things I sort of squiggled was that this is for an educational leadership search committee. So that's a one of our doctoral programs. And so that's a very different, I would normally look at the undergraduate for teaching first, but I don't know, they may be needing that research first emphasis. I also didn't know whether they were looking for a quantitative or qualitative person, and that makes a big difference. If they're working for qualitative, then the quantitative person is not a good fit. And so having that job ad is really important to sort of start unpacking some of that stuff.
I thought these letters were great illustrations, and they taught me a couple of things. I've never received a letter like this in the search committees, never, which is too bad for me.
Yeah.
And I'm used to getting letters like this. The few committees, granted, I haven't been on many committees, so that in itself was really interesting.
Well, my understanding is that you got a new ad, and you got new templates, and you got new kind of suggested and required practices. So I think that's a great, you've identified something that needs to happen very early in the search process, which is, making sure that you get those ads out to the folks that you want to have respond. And I think there's additional training for the committees and for the chairs in the other aspects of the search process. So, thank you for mentioning that. All right. Yes, please.
I'd like to say too before we wrap up is just that as we go forward, obviously in each search committee, we're going to be starting to develop rubrics for evaluating the applications themselves. Sharon and I are going to be working with all of the equity advocates who are on the search committees to go forward, develop the rubrics for phone interviews and campus interviews and final discussion and all of those things. So there's going to be an ongoing process where we're working with folks to help develop those resources for each individual.
Yep.
To that point, Sam, is there a starting point so each committee is not inventing from scratch and having you all have to recorrect every one of our same mistakes?
Yeah, we'll have some basic kind of skeletal rubrics that we can adapt.
Skeleton work. He's starting from scratch.
Yes,
Leanne. Sam and Sheridan, you're doing an equity advocates training at the retreat.
Right.
And that's open, I believe, is that open to anyone who wants to come? Okay, so that's open to anyone who wants to come. So there's going to be more talk about the role of equity advocates on the committee in that session.
And I think the aspirational goal today was to begin to think about how you could create additional tools for your committee. So the rubric is one, but if you can think of any additional tools, like maybe some sample letters that you could use to kind of calibrate expectations, or even sharing some of the things that you're bringing in terms of expectations and giving yourselves a chance to talk about your own biases a little bit before you jump into the candidate search. Might be some ways that you could build the camaraderie needed so that if something does emerge during the search, you have an opportunity to kind of say, hey, remember? All right. So you'll get back from me a report on this evaluation. So you'll see what your colleague said. You'll get the notes if you want to leave whatever notes you have all type up. And then have a great time
this week at your retreat. So thanks everybody for being here.
Yes.